All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everyone. And thanks for coming to this first Flash Talk begun by this new network, CHS at SSHA. I'm Nick Wilson, and I'm the clerk slash secretary slash temporary benevolent despot of this meeting, which is to say I'm a member of our organizing group, and I volunteered to steer the meeting today. As part of that, I'd also like to recognize other members of this organizing group, Eliza Luft, Sarah Quinn, Jacob Habeneck, Anna Scarpellis, Damon Merrill, Mitchell Stevens, but above all, Ann Orloff and Julia Adams. I think it's fair to say that very few of us would be here figuratively or even literally without the enthusiasm and support they've shown for historical social science. So we've formed this group out of the motivation to build intra and interdisciplinary links in historical social science. Our goal is to complement, not interfere with or replace the efforts already underway in places like the ASA CHS section and SSHA, hence our name. And we broadly want to support and deepen what connections may already exist. So with that in mind, check out the chat if you haven't already. Click on that link and give us your details or nominate someone you think might be interested if you haven't already done so you can keep in touch with us. And then second, if you're interested in this initiative, come join us. And you can do it right after this talk. In fact, we're a self-consciously flat organization and we're committed to diversity and inclusion. So stay. Beginning at 2:10, we're going to have our business meeting where we figure out what we're going to do next. So without further ado, let's get started with our presentation for today. Everyone is clearly very excited to be joined by Mitchell Stevens, who is a professor in the Graduate School of Education and in sociology at Stanford University. He's worked at the forefront of the sociology of higher education, as witnessed by two of his landmark studies, Creating a Class, College Admissions, and the Education of Elites, and with a couple of co-authors, Seeing the World, How U.S. Universities Make Knowledge in a Global Era. Now, Mitchell has kindly agreed to speak to us for no more than 20 minutes about how college degrees divide America. After that, we are going to enjoy a few comments from Sarah Quinn, who's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Washington and author of American Bonds, How Credit Markets Shaped a Nation. Now, after Sarah's comments, we'll have an open discussion moderated by yours truly. And if you'd like to propose a question, I'd ask you either to do the hand raising thing on Zoom, I'll keep a queue of those, or type your question into either public or private to me, the host, chat. And with that in mind, Mitchell, take it away.
All righty. Thank you, Nick. Let me share screen here. Can you guys see the screen and can you hear me?
Yes.
You can. Both of those things are true. Okay. Nick, thank you so much for your terrific work here, and just delighted that I see colleagues from several different scholarly communities. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to connect with you. And also that I have several family members here who are, for better or worse, they're going to find out what their cousin and brother and nephew do all day. If you take a moment to type the title of this forum into your web browser, and I hope you do, you will quickly find some sobering insights about the current condition of the United States. A brief quote from one of the pieces near the top of your Google search by Ryan Craig summarizes much of what you will find. He writes, "America is divided by race, gender, and geography. None of that is new. What's new is a division by education, a college divide. In the 2016 election, white voters without a college degree voted Republican by a margin of 66% to 29%, a 37% gap that opened after the Great Recession. In 2012, white men in Wisconsin without college degrees were just 5% more likely to be Republicans than Democrats. Today, it's 23%. In the long arc of American political history, the equation of college with social inequality and division is exceptional. For 150 years, Americans have turned to higher education as a mechanism of social opportunity, mobility, and inclusion. Pollsters and opinion writers can tell us a lot about how the possession or non-possession of a college degree shapes contemporary politics, but political and historical sociologists can help us understand how we got to this place. They also can help us plot a future, I think, in which the provision of post-secondary opportunity might once again be equated with affirmative national values. In my brief remarks today, and I will keep them brief, I will try to convince you that the key to doing both of those things lies in recognizing the peculiar implication of higher education in the building of the US state. Now, full confession, you're getting a Schoolhouse Rock version of American political history and political sociology here. It will have no citations in it, but I stand on the shoulders of giants, quite a few of whom are on this call, and so I'm referring to a long tradition here, but keeping it synoptic for purposes today. What do I mean by this term state? By state here, I mean any system for collectively assembling and dispersing resources among a population enforced by the powers of government. State is an awkward term in American politics, partly because the nation's federated structure distinguishes state and federal governments, but also because Americans have long greeted the very idea of government or the state with skepticism. And in fact, it's this skepticism that encouraged Americans to assemble national resources in ways that do not look or feel like government at all. Churches, schools, and charities also provide a wide variety, continue to, and can enjoy exemption from taxes on the logic that they assemble and disperse resources for public benefit, what political historical sociologists call the submerged state, or a government out of sight. As part of this tradition, colleges and universities have been important mechanisms for collective benefit since the nation's earliest days. It was not long after their basic physical survival was assured that the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony chartered Harvard College and created special mechanisms for its support in the interest of training ministers and lettered people for the edification of their settlement. And of course, this happened up and down the eastern seaboard in religious and regional communities of every description. Direct subsidy of higher education by the federal government would come from the Morrill Acts of 1862 and 1890, through which Congress sought to find a nation riven by civil war. The Morrill Acts offered state legislatures gifts of land that could be used and sold to support the creation of universities. These land grant institutions were true joint ventures, relying on contributions from multiple levels of government and other organizations. So I love this plaque because you've got some Alabama legislature in there, and you've got some Congress in there, and you've got some Methodists in there, right? Collecting a civic asset together. The founding colleges and universities was one version of a general process that the sociologist Michael Mann called social caging, the creation of a skeletal organizational system on which to build the flesh of a fully functioning society. And it's important to note here that all of this college building was a project of empire, an exercise in white Christian domination and displacement of other peoples. And like so many projects of empire, college building was pursued with great enthusiasm and moral conviction. So point one, college is part of American state building. So colleges and universities also have been important tools for waging wars, providing the nation with a Swiss Army knife of utilities over the course of US history. Now, historians and sociologists know that wars change things because they require so many resources to wage. And mobilizing those requires turning soldiers into citizens into soldiers, civilians into home front volunteers, and consumer industries into military supply chains. Fighting World War II taxed all of the resources of the US polity, and higher education was enlisted for their assembly. University campuses provided physical plants for recruiting and training military personnel. Their technical science faculties were contracted to develop weapons and communication systems, and their social scientists devised assessments to determine soldiers fit for battle. So capably did colleges and universities conduct their service that before the military combat had even ended, a national movement coalesced to offer tuition subsidies to returning veterans, a civic gift given simultaneously to soldiers and schools. Overnight, the passage of the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, the GI Bill, made college attendance a realizable possibility for nearly all white male soldiers, regardless of their prior academic accomplishments. Indeed, nearly half of them had not finished high school, and framed government subsidy of higher education as a worthy reward of national service. Now, a great deal more government money flowed to higher education after the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik 1 satellite into Earth's orbit in October of 1957. Persistent diplomatic tension with the Soviets quickly coalesced into a new and demanding form of global conflict. Congressional passage of the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, of 1958, a direct Sputnik counteroffensive, began a flow of ultimately billions of dollars to support every rung of the education ladder, from elementary schools to research universities. And virtually every major university was somehow patronized by federal investment to fight the Cold War. Now, let me flesh this out a little bit. I'm speaking to you today from my home on the campus of Stanford University, which is located on 8,000 acres of what is now exquisitely valuable real estate midway between San Francisco and San Jose. Most of those acres were a bequest of the railroad magnate Leland Stanford and his wife Jane, and are exempt from taxation. Much of the physical plant built on this property was paid for by government subsidy, and all of that subsidy was made on the presumption that this private university was pursuing a public purpose, improving the state of California and advancing democracy worldwide. So every palm tree, every blade of grass, variably underwritten by government. So by the time Lyndon Johnson assumed the presidency in 1963, government support for higher education had become a central element of the American state, in which massive investment for basic research and college credentials was dispersed through a diffuse network of thousands of schools, most of which, like Stanford, had been founded by white men and their wives to serve predominantly white communities from coast to coast. Now, President Johnson relied on higher education to enact his own vision of domestic warfare, the war on poverty. And the Higher Education Act of 1965, which comes right in the heels of the NDEA, dramatically expanded the reach of federal subsidy for college far beyond the ranks of military veterans and scientists. As one pillar of the Great Society program, the Higher Education Act supported college access as a central tenet of the American dream. Now, it's no accident that the passage of the Higher Education Act coincided with the growing visibility and controversy of the Black Civil Rights Movement, and with passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. Higher Education Act was explicitly devised as a mechanism for expanding college opportunity beyond the purview of the white men it had long primarily served. And indeed, it worked. In the subsequent decades, these congressional acts of the 60s substantially succeeded in enabling vast numbers of women and people of color to enter college. Higher education became, if not a right, then a quasi-right of citizenship for those who had finished high school. Now, spoiler alert, here's where my story turns. White middle-class Americans' resentment about big government surfaced prominently into public discourse in the 1970s. By that time, the civil rights and social welfare projects of the 1960s had begun to change the landscape of American institutions, including colleges and universities, populating them with many men and women who looked quite different than the people who had designed, built, and run them over the prior century. This shift in institutional complexion occurred simultaneously with the economic malaise of the 1970s. During this decade, the industrial giants of the US Northeast and Upper Midwest, the Blue Wall, steadily lost their muscle, bleeding jobs and capital to regions of the country with weaker union protections and overseas. Advances in transportation and communications technologies abetted the decline, and the OPEC oil embargo exacerbated all of it, combining in a toxic mix of joblessness and rising prices that economists called stagflation. The white male workers who had benefited most handsomely from veteran privileges and general economic prosperity lost a good deal of income and occupational security during those years. Now, I note here that African Americans probably suffered the most from deindustrialization during this period, as a definitive body of sociology and history make clear. And we should talk about that in the Q&A. I'm emphasizing a different part of the story here. During the same years, white voters created a formidable anti-tax movement. It began in California with the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978 and quickly spread nationwide. Movement leaders offered a rhetorical conflict between we, whose property and income taxes paid for government services, and a they, who unfairly took advantage of government subsidies. The narrative was compelling to people who imagined having worked hard to earn a prosperity that seemed to be crumbling, even while the problems of others, Blacks, immigrants, the poor, draft resistors, never employed college students, received increasing government recognition. The tax revolt symbolically transformed citizens into taxpayers, a subtle but profound ideological shift. Taxes themselves were rendered less responsibilities of citizenship than obligatory subscription fees to an unwieldy bureaucracy that played favorites. The generally high regard that colleges and universities continued to enjoy could not by itself pay the bills. The budgets of state legislatures became ever more constrained as the years went on by the tax revolts, but also by steadily rising costs of healthcare and elder care as the huge cohorts of children born immediately after World War II began to age. Legislatures' appropriations for higher education grew steadily more prone to budget cuts. Universities responded in part by raising tuition, which families increasingly paid for by taking out federally backed student loans. Universities also turned their attention to finding new patrons. Because legislatures often capped the tuition they could charge in-state residents, public schools courted customers from whom they could exact considerably higher fees. Universities touted their status as global, subsidized by foreign governments. They built dazzling campuses throughout the Persian Gulf and in major global economic hubs. Here in the United States, proudly public universities in Rust Belt states and all over the country began competing for the children of affluent families in China and India. Recruiters courted international students partly to pay the bills, but also because they tended to have high scores on the standardized tests whose averages figured into national, international ranking schemes. In the 20th century, US universities had competed with one another for lucrative government contracts. Now they compete for the top students and star researchers that feed the Shanghai and US News rankings. So that's my Schoolhouse Rock version of how the broad civic contract that once included government, citizens, and universities in a joint venture of state building has been replaced by a much more explicitly transactional academic enterprise, agnostic of national borders and fealties. In the contemporary United States, higher education is no longer a reward of citizenship and a collective national investment in a shared civic good. It is a consumer service industry, a big business, and a fiercely competitive global status system. I see the time. On November 8, 2016, Donald Trump narrowly defeated Hillary Clinton to become the 45th president of the United States. And here we return to where we began. In the 2016 Republican victory was due in large measure to its candidate's ability to ignite the passions of white people, specifically white men without college educations. These men are in many ways comparable to the World War II veterans whom the GI Bill had long ago rewarded. American patriots expecting recognition for their contributions to the nation, modestly educated, and facing almost unfathomable economic and social change. By the second decade of the 21st century, now, a college degree had become a fateful line in American life. Relatively secure employment lie on one side of it and insecurity on the other. Crossing the line is very expensive, and there has been no collectively recognized international emergency encouraging government to shoulder the cost. President Trump's Americans recognize this. They know firsthand how difficult life has become for those who cannot afford or do not desire four-year degrees. They understand that those who have spent their careers drafting social policies in universities and think tanks and government agencies have very little appreciation for what life is like in places without New York Times home delivery and international airports. So that even while the last president had rather little to say about higher education directly, part of his message was that neither college educations nor those who conferred them were national priorities. In the long arc of American history, that is extraordinary. Of course, a great deal has happened in the United States since 2016. Student loan debt has topped $1.6 trillion. We had the waves of fury about racial inequality in America in the wake of the George Floyd killings, a fury that we hadn't seen expressed at this level in generations. It was an election year. We know who won, but the presidency was not assured until legions of Trump supporters stormed the Capitol yesterday. Well, Mitchell, what do we do now? My own reading of political history suggests that 2021 is in many ways akin to prior moments in which the federal government and colleges and universities cooperated to substantially change the landscape of educational opportunity for adults. I'm going to skip forward a little bit and let that picture do its job. And what I want to suggest by rehearsing this history is that in moments of national calamity have created conditions under which new joint ventures between government, universities, and business and philanthropy have made it possible to build capacity in the post-secondary sector. I want to call that activity academic statecraft. And let's define academic statecraft as the expansion of educational opportunity for the betterment and unification of the US state. In the year 2021, what might this statecraft look like? I'm going to make a few suggestions. This academic statecraft would recognize that while Americans still have great affection for colleges and universities, that affection has substantially thinned due to anxieties about cost, debt, and fraudulent activity by for-profit providers, and a growing sense that the nation's wealthiest and most selective universities, like the one I work at, are tax-subsidized machines for laundering privilege. And I'm not sure that they're wrong. Academic statecraft in 2021 would recognize that higher education as we now know it has become part of the problem of the increasingly caste-like character of inequality in the United States. Higher education as we know it is too expensive for students and their families, too reliant on personal debt as a mechanism of public subsidy, and insufficiently reliable in enabling its students to persist in their studies and graduate with meaningfully valuable credentials. Academic statecraft in 2021 would seek to, I would submit, would seek to diminish the importance of a certain kind of college education, specifically the possession of a four-year bachelor's degree, as the benchmark for reasonably stable employment. It would develop alternative criteria for employment in civil service jobs, specifically encouraging and rewarding lower-cost two-year associate or alternative credentials, and encourage a recalibration of employment requirements in the philanthropic and private sectors. Academic statecraft in 2021 would revisit current federal funding schemes, which provide no incentive for colleges and universities to cap tuition or reduce their expectation of costly residential requirements. At the same time, it would recognize that the tax revolts of prior political generations have eviscerated the capacity of state legislatures to raise public funds for this project. So we'd have to go federal, at least in the short term. Academic statecraft today might proclaim that to Americans that their lifelong education is a shared responsibility in which everyone needs to do their part, students and workers and citizens certainly, but also state and federal governments, employers, and the very rich. It might create new forms of expropriation through taxes on high net worth individuals and firms to subsidize the creation of, I don't know, universal broadband access in the name of scaffolding human capital improvement. It also finally might recognize that colleges and universities we inherit from history are not the only organizations vying to court the educational aspirations of adults. Alphabet, Amazon, Microsoft, and others are among the many tech firms that are ambitiously developing post-secondary programs and offering them as gifts, either for commodity services or a little bit of both. We should talk about if these firms are challenging the inherited cartel that colleges and universities have on credentials. But I don't think that we should avoid or not cooperate with these new critters. What kind of organizational form might that take? That might be above my pay grade right now, but I'm happy to take advice and insight from friends. I'll stop there.
All right, Mitchell, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. And now I am going to turn it over to Sarah Quinn, and I will spotlight her. But then while she's talking, after she's done, we'll have Mitchell respond very briefly to what she has to say and then throw it open. And in the interest of that, please either register your questions in the chat, either to me privately or publicly, or throw your hand up and I'll keep a queue. Thanks very much. Sarah.
All right. Oh, thank you for that talk, Mitchell, and for this work. It's such a pleasure to be a commentator. You know, I got a preview of your statements, and I've just been turning this idea of academic statecraft around in my head. And I love how it calls on us to think in the broadest and boldest ways about education and the body politic, about education as a thing of statecraft and a thing of racecraft, and how we take that, we can take that seriously and must be thinking about education to transform each. So I see this kind of talk and effort as an essential act of sociology, and kind of learning how we think about situating ourselves in social space and as teachers, both as teachers and as students. And as I was thinking about that, you know, it brought back kind of two kind of memory for me, or kind of a thought process for me of thinking of myself as a teacher and the work that I do as a teacher. I'm in the University of Washington, which means, you know, in the spirit of this talk, is a kind of reminder that education is also part of empire building. You know, I teach and I live on Coast Salish land so that's land that touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And I've learned from my peers the importance of acknowledging that. And I try to do more acknowledging of that in my teaching and with my students. And I also try to acknowledge alongside that, I'm part of the state. There's often a moment when I'm teaching political sociology to graduate students and to undergraduates where I ask, in a seminar room, are we in the state right now? And students' jaws often drop, because of course we are, and we're never thinking about it at that moment, even as we're talking about the state in a state in a state school, in a state paid for classroom with me as a government funded employee. So there's something kind of incredibly pernicious about the way we forget these histories and these contexts. And it is this kind of constant work and project to be remembering and to kind of make that part of the story. And clear statements like the one you've given today are an essential part of that. And I'm grateful for it. And I know that I'll be teaching it. I'll say also, as a comparative historical sociologist, that I find what you've done here inspirational as a model of how to harness such deep historical knowledge into this kind of schoolhouse rock format. It is not easy to do it with such clarity and compelling language, covering so much history, and with such a sociological and political imagination at play. So I want to, in my last minute or two, just offer two questions in the spirit of giving you space to kind of respond. One has to do with what you, so you, at the end of the talk, use this great phrase, this tax subsidized machines for laundering privilege. And I want to ask you, as we think, kind of thinking forward about this moment, this window of opportunity for more academic statecraft, what do we do about that in our classrooms as spaces that stratify, given what we know about classrooms as states to stratify? What do we need to be doing as part of this new academic statecraft to make it more just and equitable? And how do we do that, especially given the decentralized nature of US education? The second question I want to ask you is about the politics of debt forgiveness, which is being discussed so much right now. And I know it's a thing that you've thought about a lot. So I want to know about how you're thinking about that and how it plays with these, with this kind of politics of white resentment and, you know, with the kind of Trump voters that you started talking about at the beginning. How are you thinking about the politics of that? How worried or not should we be about the politics of that? And do you have suggestions for policy design or policy framing given that context? So I will then pass it over to you. Thank you for this great talk.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And like I said, I'm just so delighted to be having this conversation, which summarizes many, many, many exchanges and pieces of scholarship with many of you on the call. So two quick thoughts on that. You know, I think one of the things we as academics who are, let's say academics who are, you know, sort of working at the elite end of the ecosystem, and I would say, you know, anybody with a tenure track job is in the elite end of the ecosystem, right? At this moment in history, I think we need to recognize that that the higher education that we world that we inhabit, the political economy that we inhabit, is not the one that we might have imagined to be the case when we began our careers. It's a much more instrumental, transactional, and sort of bottom line academy than many of us earlier in our careers might have imagined. I'm pointing to the spate of merit is over books that are written by you know, seasoned faculty at places like Harvard and Yale and Stanford, which I see as a sort of symptom of academics kind of recognizing that the universities that we currently inhabit do not provide the mechanisms of opportunity, social mobility, and inclusion that we might have imagined. And recognizing also that that's not a matter of who we admit to our elite campuses. It's really about the position of elite campuses relative to the larger human capital system. I just think we should start to talk about that and not presume that our schools by themselves can solve this problem by just doing a little bit better what we always do. That we need to sort of think about the role of the University of Washington and Stanford in relation to the entire order of post-secondary provision. I think is one way to do it, just to shift the conversation from what we can do better to what we can do to contribute to the whole polity. And the second one I think is really tough. You know, in one sense, you know that $1.6 trillion is a problem that's not going to go away, and debt forgiveness by itself will not fix it. I have come to worry that if we had a massive debt forgiveness program, it could ignite yet more of the resentment that I'm talking about. It'll feel like another giveaway to already privileged people. I would hope that the Biden administration, if it does that, would parallel that with a very robust program for workforce development, for opportunity creation for people who've never been to college or don't want to go to college. I think if debt forgiveness were defined as part of a larger project of opportunity creation, we'd be likely to mitigate that problem. And the last thing I'll say is, I think workforce development needs to be radically renovated and elevated to a national priority, not a second or third tier social welfare program, which it was made into in the 70s. So if I were to bet the store, that's what I would bet, is gentrifying workforce and valorizing workforce as a central tenet of post-secondary, workforce development as a central tenet of post-secondary education.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mitchell. Now, as we kick off our more general discussion, I'd like to just point out that Mitchell has rather emphatically asked that this be as conversational as possible, but we also have 68 people participating in the Zoom right now. So I'm going to institute the following system. We have 2 people in the queue to ask questions now. If you would like to get in that queue, use the little I raise my hand icon or message the chat or me privately. If you have something immediate that you'd like to add that's relatively brief, hold up your coffee cup icon and I will hop you in the queue. But please, again, use that power only for good. So with that being said, our first question comes from Elizabeth Clemens.
Hello, it's absolutely wonderful to see you and to have a chance to talk. So I wanted to start where you started with the sort of political anger of those without college degrees, and to bring in something that we know from public opinion surveys, which is that a piece of that is hostility to government. And a piece of that is also a sense that government has failed to do things. So both of those elements are going on. And I want to focus on the second one and sort of ask what role the university in this dynamic you've described of being tax subsidized machines for laundering privilege can be an opening to think about the lack of responsiveness of government. And that's asking you to bring in one of your other wonderful lines, the university is sovereign. Is this a sovereign that is unresponsive to key pieces of government? But to also think about something we've discussed before, which is universities as instrumentalities of the very wealthy. And I'll just end with today's headline news at the University of Chicago, which is a $75 million naming gift to the School of the Social Service Administration, which is our social work school. Largest donation ever to a social work school. So, that suggests a different kind of shift in control.
Yeah, thank you for that. I do think in this moment, this accumulated moment of anti-governmentism in the United States, I'm optimistic enough to think that universities sort of substantial autonomy from government gives them a window for new forms of civic action, right? Americans still trust colleges and universities a lot more than they trust something called Washington, right? So the other great thing about universities is they're connected with every other institutional domain. So they are instrumentalities for all sorts of collective action. And what I'm crossing my fingers on is that, and we're already seeing this happening in different, like Arizona State University, Georgia Tech, University of Central Florida, Purdue, the juggernaut that is Purdue at present. I think you're seeing the kind of civic action that I'm talking about taking place in other parts of the post-secondary ecology. What I'm really hoping is that there can be more stories like the one you just told, coming from Harvard and Stanford and Princeton, and the schools that are sort of able to engage in academic statecraft in a different way. I think it could go either way. I think these schools are so affluent that they could just detach themselves from the political project, right, and make it somebody else's problem. But I'm hopeful that we have a window of opportunity where we could convince those schools to come up with novel strategies for collective action along the lines of what you talked about.
I just add
That's what I'm
that
trying to
they're
do.
non-democratic, though, and so
Oh,
really
yeah.
confronting that, right?
Darn it. Why'd you have to bring that up? Right.
All right, so we've developed quite a queue. So let's move next to Dave Baker. Dave?
And I might decide just to take a few so we get as many voices as possible. Is that okay
All
with
right,
you?
if, by unanimous consent imposed by me in a non-democratic fashion,
Okay.
Of course. So Dave
Just
Baker,
to hear
can
a
you
bunch
ask
of
your question?
voices, yeah. Mhm.
So thank you, Mitchell. I'm also new to this group. I'm a sociologist of education. I study the impact of education on human society, and therefore I look a lot at universities. And Mitchell, I really appreciate your quick, sweeping view of history and university in the United States, as you promised. Let me bring up the other side of things that you might be interested in commenting on. And you know, everybody always explains this divide now and kind of looks down a little bit, and also it says, well, what's the problem with those folks who haven't gotten a college education? They're causing lots of problems and so forth. You can flip that on its head, actually. And what we now know about people getting college educated and more is that they're a very different political animal than what the political scientists thought. They thought they were all going to be nice little citizens who quietly voted a little bit to the left and read the New York Times, and once in a while the Wall Street Journal. But what we now know is that they're these robust political organizers of anything and everything, all kinds of ideologies. And so I would lay at the feet of the expansion of college this hyper-political situation that we have and will continue in the world. So, and you know some of the evidence of that. Dave Kamens and others have been writing about this for a while, and there's a lot of empirical work. So what about that? How has this massive college incorporation, university incorporation, how does that change the politics moving forward in a democracy?
Wonderful, thank you very much, Dave. Next, let's take two more. Next, we have Eric Liebeck. Eric.
Hello, thank you, Mitchell. That was wonderful. Really great survey of university history. I suppose kind of getting into some of the stakes of where that leads us to, I think that these are related to the trends, and I agree with you that 2021 is kind of like an inflection point where we're kind of seeing this tension between meritocracy, democracy, and a kind of liberal tradition almost reaching its limits in a certain sense, and that we need to do something different in the future. And I think we sort of have two choices. One is kind of universal tertiary education, and another is just a different version where we're actually involving advanced learning in everyone's lives or something like that. But that's not really something that academics have thought about. We tend to think of ourselves in terms of professional development and the reproduction of our academic selves and PhD students and so forth. But I suppose what I'm wondering about is, especially now that there's a sort of partisan divide, because that actually used to be the opposite. Republicans used to be the more educated party, and Democrats the odd populists with anti-evolution and whatever. So what I'm curious about is what do academics do in this moment that you're saying we should have another federal program to, when academics are actually targets of one of the major parties. And so we can't really take this like aloof, we're just here for knowledge sake anymore. We actually have to be political defendants at the very least. And that's very difficult to do. So that's my question, I guess.
Oof. Great. And then, yeah, you've got two easy ones. So we've got the last one coming, not kidding. But our last one in this little bundle comes from Jacob Habeneck, who comes to us from Linköping University.
Yes, and as you might have imagined from that name, I'm out here in Sweden, and I couldn't help but feel obliged to ask a kind of comparative question. Here in Sweden and other parts of continental Europe, students have far less of a debt load than they do in the United States, although it is increasing. There's certainly more opportunities for vocational and two-year, at least two-year equivalent degrees. And yet at the same time, this role of college degrees as this incredible economic and political dividing line is also a major issue out here in Europe. You know, Thomas Piketty has written this whole book on it. And so I find myself thinking about how to expand this, this framework that you've given us to this comparative context. And, you know, there's certainly a way, I found myself thinking about it when you were talking about a kind of shift from thinking of tertiary education as being a machine for laundering privilege to a broader perspective on workforce development as being maybe one way of thinking about that political side of it. But I would love to hear you say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I'm really glad you surfaced that. And I was thinking about the cross-national issue in Eric's remarks as well. Yeah. I mean, I did tell a decidedly American story, and I think it is a decidedly American story, right? The relationship, the organization of post-secondary education in the United States, its heterogeneity, its quasi-sovereignty, its plural resource streams, its religiosity, all that stuff, and also its relationship to other systems of social provision. In fact, I'm engaged in a project now with colleagues from seven countries, including Sweden, on sort of thinking about higher education and state building across Europe and since 1945. Someone just told me that the Soviet Union had a Cold War II, and that they mobilized human capital of adults, through these same decades as well. So, thinking comparatively about the role and meaning, I would say, in particular, of higher education and projects of social provision, I think is extraordinarily important. I think that's a huge domain of inquiry that I would like to, to continue to develop with people like you. But I do think recognizing the Americanness of this is very important if we're going to have concerted civic action here in the near term. On Eric's point, yeah, I mean, boy, this is not what our grandfathers and great-grandfathers intended when we developed College for All as a social mobility and inclusion project, right? No one intended that the four-year bachelor's degree would become a dividing line in American political culture. That's a grand unintended consequence that I would say academics must now reckon with. Right? We can't just pretend that it's not there, and we can't just, grow the numbers that are on one side of that line and think that that's enough. Fully 35% of Americans have a four-year degree at present. That's up 6 percentage points in the last decade, right? That's not a viable political strategy, on my view. So what I see, Eric, is what I would like to see is multifarious action by a wide range of organizations. I want 16 Michael Crows, I want, I want to see what happens to, what educational entrepreneurs in historically Black colleges and universities do over the next 10 years with the much deserved flow of funds they're likely to get. I want sort of new ways of thinking about post-secondary provision that don't say college on them. And I kind of feel like that's all that we can do in the near term is kind of run as fast as we can to re-narrate opportunity creation in fresh ways. David, I would just say, I mean, worldwide demand for, certificates conveyed in English and a handful of other languages is not going backwards. Whether or not those will be purveyed primarily by organizations called colleges and universities, or they'll be purveyed by something that looks more like LinkedIn, is, I think, the open question. And so I think the challenge is not, demand is not going backward. What the organization of that demand, fulfillment looks like, and whether that fulfillment is defined as a business sector or a civic sector, or some combination of business and civic, I think that's the big question, right? What do we as what kind of human capital system, shall we say, do we as academics want the nation to build over the next decade, and how could our institutions help the nation build that, build that future?
Wonderful, Mitchell. Thank you. This is a wonderful discussion so far. Next up, in our second bundle, we have Margot Mahan. Margot?
Can't hear you, Margot.
Margot? Yeah, we can't hear you. I'm sorry. You might have to unmute yourself.
And now she's frozen. Oh, now she's back. Now
well,
she's back.
Margot, while you're sorting that out, let's go then to Christina Greger.
Can you?
Oh, you have it now? Go ahead.
Okay, you can hear me. Okay, sorry.
Yes.
I get the beach ball every time I try to do something on Zoom, so it takes a little while. Yeah, part of the reason why I'm commenting at all is because my own research forcibly took me to the state of Alabama. And even though it was like one sentence in one slide, I feel like this is the first presentation that I can actually say something about Alabama because I have some expertise in that area. And really, what that actually makes me think of is it's important to recognize that it's not that, that these sort of academic policies contributed to white middle class American males as a matter of course, right? We have to appreciate that to the extent that Black people and in other parts of the country, people of color were excluded from these educational opportunities. It was very intentional. You know, it was physically violent, as we know, with Alabama, for example, but also just in terms of the internal mechanisms of how to build an education system. There is a lot of concern about ensuring that white students had an advantage over non-white students. And the other one, because I love this idea of academic statecraft. And so I'm just thinking of the ways in which we can think about these historical effects that are, very much at play now. And the other one is the divestment in education that occurred during the industrialization, right? I mean, in some jurisdictions, it's almost one-to-one to the criminal justice system. I mean, that's a huge factor as well. We also live in a time when there's negative sentiment toward affirmative action, and basically paying attention to race at all. When we have policies, we have to sort of do a cookie cutter, right? One size fits all. Which, leads me to not everyone who goes to universities is privileged, or has wealth, right? The wealth inequality in the wealth gap. For a Black student, for example, to have a college degree, like that's a credential that can actually be life-changing, to be able to say that on a job application or what have you. At the same time, debt is one of the #1 things that decreases the value of a college degree, for Black students as well. And lastly, one of the really sort of neat ways in which the process of trying to racially divide who has access to education has been this, what you were saying with the whole taxes thing, right? It's been segregation, residential segregation, and that is arguably worse, according to some estimates, when it comes to schooling these days than it was back then. So yeah, it's a dilemma because, again, we can't make race-based policies, right? Because we're post-racial, but there really are some benefits of this academic statecraft moving forward. There are parts of it that are highly beneficial, that would be highly beneficial for people of color, and not so much for, white people with a degree.
May I just briefly interject with the chair's prerogative for a second? Mitchell, we have 5 minutes remaining in our discussion, and we have 8 people in the queue.
Should we just,
Shall we just collect questions and comments?
yeah, let's just hear them all. And
All right.
let me just say also that, like, you know, I kind of live for this stuff. Like I am in fact, you know, trying to, you know, develop some narratives that might take advantage of this moment of great uncertainty in a positive way. So, you know, please just continue the dialogue. Figure if you're going to come up with some crazy ideas and try them out, you know, you may as well do them in 2021 in Silicon Valley. So let's just hear as many voices as possible, and just I'll appreciate them.
Christina Greger.
Thank you, and thank you, Mitchell, for that great historical overview. So my question is about workforce development and the sort of relationship to political economy, because I think in the narrative that you painted, this kind of golden age of, you know, World War II era, universities as an engine of social mobility or being a reward for citizenship. That's also a time, of course, when union jobs are at their height and union power, like worker power, is at its height. And that's, you know, the reason that education can be an engine of social mobility in that period is also because there are good jobs to go into.
Yeah.
So now, you know, at a time when union power has been eviscerated, I think a focus on sort of workforce development and universities as an engine of opportunity. I mean, like we can't recreate that unless we fix the problem of like the lack of good jobs to go into. And so when you talked about, you know, rethinking employment requirements, I just wonder, like, how can education policy do that? Like, how does education policy have the leverage to do that if we think of, you know, or at least I understand the reasons why we had that in the past were because workers actually had power in the economy when now they have very little power. And so maybe our energy as academics should be on thinking about, you know, ways of fighting for the power of the labor of adjuncts, or sort of rethinking labor in the university, if that's, and like building up worker movements, if that's sort of the angle that could really try to address these economic and the issue of jobs first, before we think about, you know, educational policy kind of from a more technocratic, or I don't know, sort of top-down policy-making perspective. So I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Earlier in private chat, Larissa Caldera wanted to ask a question. Larissa, you're up.
Hi, I'm Larissa. I'm a graduate student at the University of Washington. I'm interested primarily in social movements and institutional change. So my question was, a lot of the institutional work talks about path dependency and positive feedback. And so since we have this institution and it's been around for such a, not such a long time, there's definitely institutions that have been around longer, but we're in a fulfilling and reifying process. And we know that when we change, are trying to change an institution, it's very difficult to just get rid of the original scaffolding. So what kinds of aspects of the current education system and university system offer a path forward in the way that you envision? Because it seems as though the situation we're in now, we're not going to be able to get rid of a lot of these things. We might have to work with them and adapt them. So what are those scaffoldings that we can build off of without jeopardizing the whole institution, because people aren't really going to leave it anytime soon?
Great.
Thank you.
So just to get through the queue, we're probably going to have to go to 2:10. So by my own imposition, we're going to do that. So next up, we have Constance Malpass.
Thanks very much. I'm curious to know where Mitchell and others, of course, see the unbundling of higher education. And here I'm thinking specifically of Tony Carnevale's work on academic programs being the unit or currency of value, where you see that fitting into the framework of academic statecraft. And particularly, do we need to think about enlisting support for a vision of higher education that takes an above the program level view? Or do we not? Do you see some of those other post-secondary providers, you referenced some of the tech firms, as absorbing some of that program?
I got to say one thing. I think that is the huge challenge of our time for universities. What is their relation to these other firms that are not universities, but have produced more information and perhaps more knowledge than any university does, that has more resources than many nation states? What is our relationship to Amazon and Facebook? And what should it be if the university is a civic actor? Huge question mark.
Okay, next up we have Angel Parham.
Hello, thank you so much for the talk. It's really stimulating. So on this idea of academic statecraft, one of the questions I wanted to ask is what is the value of the education we offer? To what extent is it only or mainly economic? Because I feel like a lot of the questions have been getting mainly toward, economic opportunity. That's very important. So I don't want to downplay that, but I'm just asking because I'm thinking in terms of, resentment of various populations, of lagging behind. That part of the issue, I think, is economic opportunity, but I wonder what is the value of what we're offering beyond that as also ways of building relationships with, and part of what you had mentioned was, other forms of getting this education out there. There are other benefits of having the kind of education that's offered at a university level. I'm thinking of the Odyssey project at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where faculty offer 4-credit courses to low-income adults. Many single mothers, they do actually get credit for that, and then they have the option of going on to degree, or they might just keep those credits that they have. But is there some value in that? It may actually increase their human capital for a better job, while also simultaneously offering other benefits. And I'm wondering about that for other adults, even for white working class. And so I'll just leave it with, can we think along a different kind of model? If we think, say, about public libraries as a model, right? So you go to the library to borrow books, but that's not the only thing you get out of having public libraries. It becomes this community center. Is there maybe a way of using a different model for thinking about what we want to do?
Great. So next we have Atef Saeed, who asked a question earlier in the chat. Atef, would you like to restate it, or do you just want to let it stand?
I restate it.
Okay.
It's, maybe it's piggyback on what Angel was saying about not only the economics, but also the earlier comment about the race education, or academic, was racecraft, statecraft. So how to situate the academic statecraft within a broader educational statecraft as a multifaceted project.
Thank you.
So we have 3 to go here, and the first is James Schulman. James, are you still with us? I see he has departed our fair group. So next up then, we have Virginia Sapiro.
Thank you. Gina Sapiro at Boston University. I'm working on I'm in the middle of a project on the history of higher education in the US as related to the development of state and society. So this was particularly interesting. If there's anything I've learned, it's that it's a lot more complicated than that, which too, if you're looking at it. And in particular, when I look back, I don't know of a time when higher education really so uniformly contributed to upward mobility. It did for very particular groups in very particular places in very particular sectors, but not overall. higher education, you know, for most of the first century of education was not as related to elite status as we think. The majority of liberal arts colleges that were founded in the first century up to the Civil War were found in little settlement towns, and it was mostly to be able to get preachers and teachers. And these were not rich people. By and large, they didn't even have tuition. What faculty and students did was they had to do all the labor for the college, build the buildings, bring in the wood, start the fires, do all that kind of thing. And so I think, and you know, when you move to the HBCUs and so forth, that's another huge sector. That's a really good example also, that shouldn't just be put to the side of, well, those were different kinds of things. That was very part and parcel. So I think we have some very good examples from earlier in history about these fraught issues of higher education. What's it for? Is it for economic gain and all of that? The other thing, building really on what Angel said earlier, nice to meet you, is the variety of institutions from especially the Civil War through the 1920s that were raising exactly these issues of whole bunches of people missed by colleges and universities, whole bunches of skills, whole bunches, and you know, you can do the chautauquas, you can do the beginning of the municipal colleges, not urban colleges, but municipal colleges, the libraries, the art institutes, the hospitals, and go on about extension, certainly, having lived at the University of Wisconsin for 30 years. And so I think we can look back and you can see not only a variety of institutions really grappling with the kinds of things we're grappling with now, but some very deep and profound writings about exactly these same issues. And we can learn from those because they were arm wrestling with just what we're arm wrestling with now. Anyway, really great questions. I'll look forward to seeing more.
Wonderful. And then the ultimate question goes to the distinguished gentleman from Evanston, James Mahoney.
Oh, great to see you, Mitchell. You know, in the bell curve, Murray and Herrnstein's famous, notorious book, you know, they warn of a cognitive elite taking over. And, you know, their view of the cognitive elite is that it's sort of rooted in innate intelligence. You know, but in some ways they arrive at a similar spot to what you're arriving at, arguably. And they were writing in the 1990s. And, you know, recently Yuval Harari, the author of Sapiens and those other books, you know, he's same place he arrives at, a cognitive elite. And he thinks it will increasingly look down on the uneducated. And both of them suggest that, you know, elites in general are elites and they don't want to give up their power. And so they don't. And if you know, this university education cognitive status is giving power, you have a real severe problem, because the source of their power is historically viewed as this great equalizing device. And it's kind of, you know, Lenin said that, you know, democracy is the best possible shell for capitalism. In some ways, maybe, you know, this the educational system is the best possible shell for the cognitive elite.
So,
well, how's that for a provocation?
Yeah,
Thank
I was
you,
about
James.
to say, Mitchell, if it's okay with you, why don't we take that as exactly that, a provocation? And in the spirit of this being an ongoing conversation, not impose on you 30 seconds to answer all of that. With that being said, let me just thank all of you for such a wonderful discussion to kick off CHS